With a sharp crash, the shattered champagne flute brought an immediate hush over the ballroom. Drawn by the spectacle, 200 pairs of billionaire eyes turned toward Sterling Hayes, the city's most infamous hedge fund heir, who was smirking at a waitress kneeling in a puddle of cristal. "Go on," he sneered, tossing a crisp $100 bill onto the wet marble. "Dance for it. Show us what the hired help considers grace." Anticipating tears and a humiliated retreat to the kitchen, Sterling was caught off guard when Crystal slowly rose to her feet and kicked off her sensible catering shoes. As she lifted her head, the frightened server vanished. Replacing her was a phantom from the city's most prestigious stage, ready to make a complete mockery of Sterling. The grand atrium of the Belvedere estate was a monument to excess. Vaulted ceilings painted with Renaissance-style frescoes loomed over a sea of imported Italian marble, currently occupied by New York's most insufferable elite. The occasion was the annual Sterling Fitzgerald Charity Gala, an event where the ultra-wealthy gathered to bid on yachts they would never use, all under the guise of philanthropy. For Crystal Woods, however, the Belvedere was a gilded cage of exhaustion. Crystal adjusted the collar of her stiff, suffocatingly white catering uniform. Her black slacks were a size too big, and her orthopedic shoes, though necessary for the grueling 14-hour shifts, felt like lead weights. She balanced a silver tray, laden with beluga caviar blinis, and glasses of vintage Dom Perignon on her left hand, weaving seamlessly through the throngs of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. She moved with an eerie, frictionless glide, a remnant of a past life she tried desperately to forget. "Table 4 is a nightmare," whispered Sarah, another server, as they briefly crossed paths near the sprawling ice sculpture of a swan. Sarah looked on the verge of tears, her tray trembling. "It's Hayes. He's already sent back his steak twice because it wasn't slaughtered with enough enthusiasm, or whatever sick joke he's making tonight." Crystal sighed, her chest tightening. Sterling Hayes, the 32-year-old billionaire who had inherited a massive real estate empire and a hedge fund from his father, only to aggressively expand it through ruthless corporate takeovers. He was known in the tabloids for his fast cars, his revolving door of supermodel girlfriends, and his utter contempt for anyone whose net worth didn't end in at least 8 zeros. "I'll take table 4, Sarah," Crystal said softly, her voice steady. "Go cover the terrace. Catch your breath." "Are you sure? He's in rare form tonight." "I can handle a bully," Crystal replied, though the dull ache in her left ankle, a phantom pain from a titanium screw, throbbed in warning. 3 years ago, Crystal Woods hadn't been serving caviar. She had been the one people paid hundreds of dollars to watch. She was the youngest principal dancer the Metropolitan Ballet had seen in a decade. Critics called her a prodigy, a generational talent with gravity-defying leaps and an emotional depth that brought audiences to tears. But gravity always wins eventually. A devastating fall during a rehearsal of Swan Lake, a shattered tibia, and 3 botched surgeries later, her career was violently ripped away. Worse than the physical loss was the financial ruin. Her younger sister Chloe had been diagnosed with severe aplastic anemia shortly after Crystal's accident. The ballet company's insurance dropped Crystal, the medical bills piled up like a suffocating avalanche, and the spotlight faded into the harsh, fluorescent glare of hospital waiting rooms. Crystal traded her point shoes for non-slip catering flats, swallowing her pride to keep her sister alive. She took a deep breath, compartmentalizing the memories, and glided toward table 4. Sterling Hayes sat at the head of the table like a feudal lord surveying his peasants. He wore a custom Tom Ford tuxedo that probably cost more than Crystal made in a year. His dark hair was impeccably styled, and a smirk played permanently on his lips as he held court. Beside him, sat a gaggle of sycophants, junior partners and trust fund heirs like Brooks Harding and Wyatt Kensington, hanging on to his every word. I told the board, either we liquidate the pension fund to cover the acquisition, or I walk, Sterling was saying loudly, swirling his scotch. You should have seen their faces. Like I asked them to sacrifice their firstborns. It's just numbers, gentlemen. People get too attached to sentiment. Crystal approached from his right, the textbook angle for service. "Excuse me, sir," she murmured, lowering the tray slightly. "Fresh champagne?" Sterling didn't even look at her. He simply thrust his empty glass into the air, expecting her to pluck it away and replace it instantly. Crystal did so smoothly, her movements precise and economical. "The problem with the working class," Sterling continued, raising his voice so it carried to the neighboring tables, "is they have no ambition. They settle for mediocrity. They carry trays and pour drinks because they lack the discipline to conquer." Crystal felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks, but she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. "Keep your head down. Chloe needs the insurance from this catering company." She moved to refill Brooks's glass. "Look at this," Sterling sneered, finally gesturing vaguely in Crystal's direction without actually making eye contact. "No offense, sweetheart, but what's the ceiling here? Head waitress? Manager of a glorified soup kitchen?" Brooks and Wyatt chuckled, a cruel, sycophantic sound. "Sir, your champagne," Crystal said evenly, refusing to engage. Sterling finally turned his gaze upon her. His eyes were a pale, icy blue, entirely devoid of warmth. He looked her up and down, taking in her plain uniform, her tightly pulled back hair, the lack of makeup. He looked at her not as a person, but as a prop in his evening's entertainment. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Crystal, sir." "Well, Crystal," Sterling said, leaning back and crossing his legs. "Tell me, do you ever aspire to be anything more than the background scenery in my life?" The orchestra, positioned on a raised dais at the far end of the atrium, was playing a soft, lilting Mozart piece. But to Crystal, the music seemed to fade into a dull roar. The blood pounded in her ears. She could feel the eyes of the adjacent tables sliding toward them, drawn by the magnetic pull of Sterling Hayes's manufactured drama. "I aspire to do my job well, Mr. Hayes," Crystal said, her voice remaining carefully neutral. "Is there anything else I can get for your table?" Sterling laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Did you hear that, Brooks? She aspires to do her job well. How quaint, how painfully pedestrian." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the linen tablecloth. "You know, my father used to say you can tell everything about a person by how they move. Winners walk with purpose. Losers, they shuffle." He was looking directly at her orthopedic shoes. Crystal's grip on her silver tray tightened until her knuckles turned white. "I've watched you all night," Sterling continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have a certain stiffness, a mechanical compliance. It's boring. I bet you've never done a spontaneous thing in your life. I bet you don't even know how to have fun." "I'm currently working, sir," Crystal replied, taking a half step back to remove herself from his immediate orbit. "Oh, don't run away," Sterling said, his tone shifting from mockery to a dangerous kind of playfulness. He suddenly reached out to grab a fresh glass of champagne from her tray, but he didn't grab the stem. He deliberately swiped his heavy, gold Rolex against the edge of the silver platter. The impact wasn't an accident. It was a calculated strike. The tray tilted violently. Crystal's dancer reflexes kicked in, and she managed to salvage the caviar, but 3 full crystal flutes of Dom Perignon toppled over. They shattered against the edge of the table, raining glass and sticky, pale gold liquid all over Crystal's uniform, and the pristine marble floor. A collective gasp echoed from the surrounding tables. The music seemed to momentarily falter. Crystal stood frozen, drenched in freezing wine, staring at the shattered crystal at her feet. Panic seized her throat. If Mr. Gable, the ruthless catering manager, saw this, she would be fired on the spot. "Oh, look what you've done," Sterling said loudly, his voice feigning shock, though his icy blue eyes danced with malicious glee. "Clumsy. Just tragically clumsy. This is why you're stuck at the bottom, Crystal. You lack grace." Wyatt Kensington snickered, hiding a laugh behind his hand. Several women at the neighboring table whispered behind their fans, looking at Crystal with a mixture of pity and disgust. Mr. Gable, a red-faced, sweating man in an ill-fitting suit, materialized almost instantly from the shadows of the kitchen doors. "What happened here? Oh, good God. Mr. Hayes, I am so incredibly sorry. This girl is new. She's completely incompetent." "It's fine, Gable," Sterling interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. He stood up, towering over Crystal. "It's not her fault she's uncoordinated. It's genetics, but it is ruining my evening." "I will have her fired immediately, sir," Gable stammered, grabbing Crystal roughly by the elbow. "Crystal, you're done. Get your things." The words hit Crystal like a physical blow. Fired. Without this job, she couldn't afford the copay for Chloe's next round of immunosuppressants. The desperation cracked her careful, stoic facade. "Mr. Gable, please," Crystal whispered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't—" He hit the tray. "I need this job. Please." Sterling watched her beg, a cruel smile stretching across his face. This was what he wanted. He wanted to break her. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills and tossed them casually into the puddle of spilled champagne at Crystal's feet. "I'll tell you what, Gable, let's make this interesting," Sterling announced, his voice projecting across the room. More guests turned to watch. The entire quadrant of the atrium was now a captive audience. "I feel bad for the girl, so I'll give her a chance to earn her keep, and a little tip." He looked down at Crystal. "You want to keep your job? You want this money? Dance for it." The room went dead silent. Even the orchestra stopped playing, the musicians peering over their music stands. Crystal stared at him, uncomprehending. "Excuse me? You heard me," Sterling sneered. "You're so stiff, so boring. Show us some grace. Dance. Right here, in the mess you made. Entertain us. If you can make us applaud, I'll tell Gable to let you stay, and you keep the 500. It was the ultimate humiliation, the court jester performing for the king's amusement. Mr. Gable hissed in her ear, "Do it, Crystal, or you're out the door right now." Crystal looked at the money soaking up the expensive alcohol. $500. It was a week's groceries. It was part of the hospital bill. She looked up at Sterling Hayes, who was waiting for her to break into tears, to flee in shame, to cement his superiority. A strange, unnatural calm suddenly washed over Crystal. The panic evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. He wanted grace? He wanted a performance? For 3 years, she had hidden from the music. She had hidden her body, her talent, her soul beneath baggy uniforms and quiet subservience. She had let the world forget her. Crystal looked down at the puddle. She pulled her arm out of Mr. Gable's grasp. Slowly, deliberately, she reached behind her waist and untied the knot of her catering apron, letting it fall to the floor over the spilled wine. "What is she doing?" Brooks whispered. Crystal didn't answer. She stepped back from the mess. Then she reached down and took off her left orthopedic shoe. She dropped it. She took off her right shoe. She dropped it. She stood in her black socks, the cold Italian marble sending a shock up her spine. The titanium screw in her ankle throbbed, but the adrenaline rushing through her veins numbed it entirely. She rolled her shoulders back, her spine elongating, her chin tilting upward. Instantly, her posture changed. The defeated, slumped server vanished. Sterling's smirk faltered slightly. He noticed the shift. Everyone noticed it. Crystal turned her head toward the raised dais where the orchestra sat. She locked eyes with the conductor. Maestro Thomas Covington, a revered figure in the classical music world, had been hired for the evening. He was an old friend of the Metropolitan Ballet. He had conducted her final, ill-fated Swan Lake. Thomas was staring at her, his baton frozen mid-air. He squinted, leaning forward over his stand. Crystal gave him a nearly imperceptible nod, her eyes burning with a silent plea and an undeniable command. Thomas Covington gasped. He recognized the eyes. He recognized the posture. Crystal raised her arms, holding them in a perfect, flawless, preparatory position. She didn't need to speak to the maestro. She mouthed 2 words to him across the silent room. Camille. Saint-Saëns. Maestro Covington's face broke into a massive, shocked grin. He violently tapped his baton against his stand, startling his musicians. He pointed frantically to a specific sheet in their binders. Danse macabre. The dance of death. Gentlemen, Thomas whispered fiercely to his orchestra. Follow her. Do not lose her. The opening note of Danse Macabre didn't just start. It sliced through the heavy, suffocating air of the Belvedere estate like a scythe. A solitary, haunting violin plucked the midnight hour. At the first pizzicato, Crystal moved. She didn't shuffle. She didn't stumble. She executed a lightning-fast, flawless chaîné's turn, a chain of spins so rapid and perfectly balanced that the oversized black slacks she wore whipped around her legs like dark storm clouds. She stopped dead center of the open marble floor, her arms extending upward in a sharp, agonizingly beautiful line, just as the full orchestra crashed into the frantic, demonic waltz. The crowd physically recoiled. A collective wave of shock rippled through the hundreds of elite guests. Sterling Hayes took a step back, his scotch sloshing over the rim of his glass. "What the hell?" he muttered. Crystal was no longer in the room with them. She was back under the blinding theatrical lights. The marble floor was her Marley stage. The pain in her ankle was entirely eclipsed by the sheer, unadulterated power of the music surging through her blood. She lunged forward, executing a deep, sweeping penché, her back leg rising impossibly high, her chest nearly brushing the floor, demonstrating a terrifying level of flexibility and control. She held the agonizing pose for a split second longer than seemed physically possible, locking eyes with Sterling upside down. Her gaze was no longer submissive. It was predatory. As the strings swelled into a frenzied crescendo, Crystal exploded upward. She pushed off her good foot and launched into a series of grand jetés, massive soaring leaps that covered the distance of the dining floor. She hung in the air, defying gravity, a creature of pure kinetic energy. She wasn't just dancing. She was interpreting the violent, mocking tone of the music. She was dancing the macabre reality of her life, the pain, the loss, the fierce, burning will to survive. "Is that?" A wealthy dowager at a nearby table dropped her fan, her mouth hanging open. "Good heavens, that's Crystal Woods, the metropolitan prodigy. They said she would never walk right again." Whispers ignited around the room like a brush fire, catching fast and burning hot. Crystal Woods, the fallen star. What is she doing here? Maestro Covington was sweating, driving his orchestra faster, harder, completely entranced by the ghost he was witnessing. He hadn't seen anyone dance with such raw, unhinged ferocity. Since she had left the stage, Crystal spun into a rapid sequence of fouette turns right in front of table 4. Her spotting was razor-sharp, her head snapping around to fixate on Sterling Hayes with every single revolution. Whip, whip, whip. She did 10, then 20. The sheer athleticism required to execute the turns in socks on a slippery marble floor was staggering. Sterling's face had drained of all colour. The arrogant sneer was entirely gone, replaced by a slack-jawed, terrified awe. Brooks and Wyatt were perfectly still, their earlier laughter choking them in their throats. They realized they weren't watching a humiliated servant. They were watching a masterclass by an apex predator. And they were the prey. The music shifted, spiraling into a darker, more aggressive rhythm. Crystal adapted instantly. She infused the classical ballet with sharp, jagged, contemporary movements. She dropped to the floor, rolling over the shattered glass near her discarded apron, miraculously avoiding the shards, and rose fluidly, her hands framing her face in a gesture of mock horror, mirroring the tragedy of her own life and throwing it back into the faces of the people who were entertained by her suffering. Mr. Gable, the manager, was backed against a pillar, clutching his chest, realizing he had just threatened to fire one of the greatest artistic talents in the city over a spilled drink. As the music rushed toward its furious climax, Crystal sprinted toward Sterling Hayes. She didn't slow down. For a terrifying second, Sterling thought she was going to tackle him. He actually flinched, raising a hand to protect his face. Instead, a mere foot away from him, Crystal vaulted into the air. She executed a perfect, spinning tour en l'air, landing silently in a deep, agonizingly slow kneel right at his feet. The final sharp chord of the orchestra struck. Crystal froze, her head bowed, her breathing heavy but controlled. Her hair had escaped its tight bun, falling in damp, wild strands around her face. For 10 agonizing seconds, the grand atrium was completely silent. You could hear the ice melting in the swans. Then, an older gentleman at the table next to Sterling's, Richard Sterling, Sterling Hayes's estranged uncle and a notoriously tough art critic, slowly stood up. He raised his hands and began to clap. Slow, loud, deliberate claps. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. It wasn't polite golf claps. It was a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. Billionaires, socialites, and waitstaff alike were on their feet, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. The raw emotion, the undeniable brilliance of the ambush performance had shattered their cynical exterior. Crystal stayed kneeling for a moment longer. She looked down at the puddle of champagne. The $500 were still there, soaked and pathetic. Slowly she stood up. She didn't bow to the crowd. She looked only at Sterling. He was staring up at her, breathing hard as if he had run a marathon, his arrogance completely dismantled by the sheer force of her talent. He looked small. Crystal reached down and picked up the 5 soaked $100 bills. She wrung them out in her fist, letting the dirty champagne drip onto the floor. "You keep your money, Mr. Hayes," Crystal said, her voice dropping to a low, carrying whisper that only he and his sycophants could hear over the roaring crowd. "You can buy companies, you can buy obedience, but you can't buy me." She dropped the crumpled bills onto his lap. "And for the record," she added, her eyes flashing with a cold, triumphant fire, "I don't shuffle." The harsh, fluorescent lights of Mount Sinai Hospital offered a jarring contrast to the crystal chandeliers of the Belvedere estate. Crystal sat slumped in an uncomfortable vinyl chair beside her sister's bed, her body aching with a deep, bone-rattling fatigue. The adrenaline from the previous night had completely evaporated, leaving behind the throbbing reality of her titanium-fused ankle. Chloe, pale and fragile, slept soundly amidst the steady beeping of monitors. Crystal looked at her sister, a knot of pure terror tightening in her stomach. She had quit. In a moment of fiery, righteous indignation, she had walked out of the gala, leaving her uniform in a crumpled heap in the employee locker room. She had protected her pride, but pride couldn't pay the $8,000 copay for Chloe's upcoming bone marrow registry search. Crystal rubbed her eyes and finally pulled her cheap smartphone from her purse. It was completely dead. She plugged it into the wall outlet near the window. When the screen flickered to life, it nearly vibrated out of her hand. 64 missed calls, over 200 text messages. Frowning, she opened a text from Sarah, her former co-worker at the catering company. It was just a link with the message, Crystal. Oh my God, you broke the internet. Crystal clicked the link. It redirected her to a popular social media platform. A video, shot from a high angle near the ice sculptures by a prominent socialite named Caroline Wentworth, filled the screen. The caption read, "Arrogant billionaire Sterling Hayes tries to humiliate a waitress." He didn't know she was former ABT prodigy Crystal Woods. Wait for the drop. Hashtag Karma, hashtag Belvedere Swan, hashtag Sterling Hayes Adissa Trash Can. Crystal stared in shock. The video was high definition. It captured Sterling's sneer, the cruel toss of the $100 bills, and then the transformation. Set to the raw, ambient audio of the room, Crystal watched herself execute the rapid chaînés turns, her face a mask of furious concentration. The footage had perfectly caught the exact moment Sterling's arrogant smirk melted into absolute, pants-wetting terror as she bounded toward him in her final leap. The view count at the bottom of the screen read 14.2 million. It had only been 9 hours. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was an unknown number. Crystal hesitated, then answered. "Crystal, thank God I've been trying to reach you all morning." A frantic, sweating voice barked through the speaker. It was Mr. Gable. "Listen, about last night. We need you back. The phone lines at the agency are melting. People are calling just to see if we can book the Belvedere Swan for their events. I can double your hourly rate. Triple it." "I don't shuffle, Mr. Gable," Crystal said coldly. "And I don't work for cowards. Lose my number." She hung up. But as the satisfaction of hanging up faded, the dread returned. Viral fame didn't pay the hospital billing department. "Excuse me? Crystal Woods?" Crystal jumped, spinning around. Standing in the doorway of the hospital room was an older gentleman. He wore a sharply tailored tweed suit, leaning slightly on a silver-tipped walking stick. It was the man from the gala, the one who had started the standing ovation. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his voice a low, soothing baritone. "The nurses at the front desk are quite protective of you, but I can be very persuasive. I'm Richard Sterling, Sterling Hayes' uncle." Crystal instantly stiffened, crossing her arms defensively. "If you're here to offer me a hush money settlement on behalf of your nephew to take the video down, you can save your breath. I didn't post it, and I can't delete it." Richard chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Heavens no. My nephew is a walking public relations disaster, and quite frankly, a miserable excuse for a human being. Watching you dismantle his ego was the highlight of my decade. I wouldn't dream of taking that masterpiece off the internet." He stepped further into the room, his eyes softening as he looked at Chloe sleeping. "I know why you stopped dancing, Crystal. I made some calls to the Metropolitan Board this morning. I know about the fall. I know about the insurance dropping you. And I know about her." Crystal felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "What do you want, Mr. Sterling?" Richard leaned on his cane, his expression turning serious. "I am a patron of the arts, Crystal. For years I watched my brother, and now his son, use the Sterling name to bulldoze businesses and ruin lives for sport. I am launching a new philanthropic foundation, independent of Hayes Capital, an arts endowment specifically designed to support performers who have suffered catastrophic, career-ending injuries. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope, extending it toward her. I don't just want to pay for your sister's treatment, Crystal. That's charity, and you strike me as a woman who prefers to earn her keep, Richard said smoothly. I want you to be the inaugural director of choreography for the Sterling Arts Endowment. Your performance last night wasn't just a physical feat, it was a profound emotional statement. You have a voice that the stage desperately needs. Crystal stared at the envelope, her heart hammering against her ribs. I can't dance a full ballet anymore. My ankle. I'm not asking you to dance a full ballet, Richard interrupted gently. I'm asking you to create, to teach, to direct. The check in that envelope is a signing bonus. It covers Chloe's medical bills in full, up to the transplant. The rest is your salary. Crystal's hands shook as she took the envelope. She opened it. The number printed on the cashier's check made all the air rush out of her lungs. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was a lifeline. It was freedom. Why? Crystal whispered, tears finally breaking through her stoic facade. Because true grace, Richard said softly, echoing his nephew's cruel taunt from the night before, is using your power to lift others up, not tear them down. We start rehearsals in 3 months. I suggest you buy some proper shoes. High above the chaotic streets of Manhattan, the executive boardroom of Hayes Capital felt like a soundproof glass tomb. Sterling Hayes paced the length of the long mahogany table, furiously loosening his silk tie. His phone had been vibrating incessantly for 24 hours. It's everywhere, Sterling, his lead PR director, a nervous woman named Bethany, said, pointing a shaking finger at a projected screen displaying global trending topics. Hashtag Sterling Hayes is a trash can is currently trending #1 in 14 countries. The memes, sir, they are relentless. The screen showed a screenshot of Sterling cowering away from Crystal's final leap, photoshopped into various humiliating scenarios. In one, he was hiding from a cartoon mouse. In another, he was dressed as a medieval peasant groveling before a queen. "Turn that off!" Sterling roared, slamming his fist onto the table. "How is a 10-second clip of a clumsy waitress jumping around causing a stock drop?" "Because she isn't just a waitress, sir," his chief legal counsel sighed, rubbing his temples. "She's Crystal Woods, a darling of the New York arts scene who was tragically injured. The narrative writes itself. Ruthless billionaire bullies, disabled national treasure. Our institutional investors are getting jittery. The optics are toxic." Sterling stopped pacing, his pale blue eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. The humiliation he felt at the Belvedere estate was entirely foreign to him. He was a predator. He didn't bleed in public. He refused to be made a mockery by a woman who served him hors d'oeuvres. "Fix it," Sterling snarled. "Find dirt on her. Release a statement saying she was intoxicated and aggressive. Better yet, buy the catering company and liquidate it. Fire everyone. See how much public sympathy she gets when she ruins the livelihoods of 50 other working-class losers." "We can't do that, sir," Bethany stammered. "It will only validate the bully narrative." "Then find her weak point," Sterling yelled, veins bulging in his neck. "Everyone has leverage. Find hers and squeeze until she publicly apologizes to me." Within an hour, Sterling's private investigators found the weak point. Chloe Woods, Mount Sinai Hospital, aplastic anemia, drowning in medical debt. A slow, vicious smile spread across Sterling's face. He picked up his phone and dialed his personal banker. "I want to buy a portfolio of medical debt from Mount Sinai, specifically anything attached to a Crystal Woods. I don't care what it costs. I want to own her life by the end of the day." But when Sterling's lawyers attempted to aggressively acquire the debt, they hit a brick wall. The hospital informed them that as of 11 a.m. that morning, the Woods family accounts had a zero balance. They were paid in full by an anonymous trust. Sterling was bewildered. Who would bail out a waitress? The answer arrived an hour later, not via a phone call, but through a highly publicized press release that landed directly on Bethany's desk. She printed it out and silently slid it across the mahogany table to Sterling. Richard Sterling announces the Phoenix Endowment for the Arts, appoints former prodigy Crystal Woods as inaugural director, fully funds sister's life-saving medical treatment. Sterling stared at the paper, the words blurring together. His uncle. The sanctimonious, art-obsessed outcast of the family had swooped in and completely neutralized Sterling's leverage. Not only had Richard protected Crystal, but he was elevating her, giving her a massive public platform right in the middle of Sterling's PR nightmare. "Get my car," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated rage. Now, Sterling Hayes bypassed his security detail and drove his Aston Martin recklessly through midtown traffic, pulling up to the curb outside the prestigious Lincoln Center. His uncle maintained a private office complex there for his philanthropic endeavors. Sterling stormed through the glass doors, ignoring the protests of the receptionist, and kicked open the heavy oak doors to Richard's private suite. Richard was sitting at his desk, casually sipping Earl Grey tea. Sitting across from him, reviewing legal contracts, was Crystal. She had traded her catering uniform for a simple, elegant black turtleneck and slacks. She looked healthy. She looked powerful. "Sterling," Richard said, not even blinking at the dramatic entrance. "To what do we owe the pleasure? Did you come to apologize to my new director?" "You think this is funny, old man?" Sterling spat, marching up to the desk. "You think you can use the family name to fund this charity case? Just to spite me?" "I am using my own money, Sterling. Money I made while you were still throwing tantrums in boarding school," Richard replied coldly. "And Crystal is not a charity case. She is an investment." Sterling turned his furious gaze on Crystal. "You think you've won? You think some viral video and my uncle's pity money changes who you are? You're still nothing. I have a team of lawyers who will bury this new foundation in so much red tape it will take a decade to open its doors. I will make sure no venue in this city hosts your little dance recitals." Crystal didn't flinch. She slowly closed the folder in front of her and stood up. The height difference was still there, but the power dynamic had entirely shifted. "You don't understand how the world works anymore, Mr. Hayes," Crystal said, her voice eerily calm, devoid of the fear he so desperately craved. "You think power is money and lawyers. You think power is making people afraid of you." She picked up her phone from the desk and tapped the screen. She turned it around to face him. "This is the GoFundMe page that my former co-worker, Sarah, set up for my sister this morning, completely independent of your uncle's generous offer," Crystal explained. "It was shared by 3 celebrities, 2 Olympic athletes, and about 1 million regular people who are absolutely sick of men like you." Sterling looked at the screen. The goal was $100,000. The current amount raised, in less than 5 hours, was $1.4 million. "I don't need your uncle's money to survive anymore, Sterling," Crystal said, dropping the phone back onto the desk. "I have an army behind me now. If you try to block this foundation, if you try to stop our performances, I won't hire lawyers. I will just go on camera. I will tell 14 million people exactly what you are doing, and I will watch them tear your company down to the studs." Sterling swallowed hard. The silence in the room was deafening. He looked at Crystal, really looked at her, and finally realized the catastrophic error he had made at the Belvedere estate. He hadn't just bullied a waitress. He had awakened a dormant force of nature and handed her a megaphone. "You're out of your depth, nephew," Richard added quietly, taking a sip of his tea. "I suggest you leave before she decides to choreograph your exit." Sterling's jaw clenched so tight he felt a tooth crack. He looked between the two of them, the realization of his absolute defeat settling heavy in his gut. Without a word, the arrogant millionaire turned on his heel and walked out the door, the sound of his expensive leather shoes clicking rapidly down the hallway, a pathetic, retreating shuffle. 6 months after the Belvedere Estate Gala, the air in Studio A of the Lincoln Center complex smelled of rosin, sweat, and intense focus. Crystal Woods stood at the front of the room, leaning lightly on a sleek, carbon fiber cane that Richard had gifted her. She didn't strictly need it to walk anymore, but it helped ease the strain during grueling 8-hour rehearsal days. Before her stood 20 of New York's most promising contemporary and classical dancers, their chests heaving as they waited for her critique. "Better," Crystal said, her voice projecting effortlessly across the vast, mirror-lined room. "But Maya, in the second movement, you're still bracing for the fall. You're anticipating the floor. Don't fight gravity. Let it pull you down, and use that kinetic energy to rebound. The tragedy isn't in falling, it's in staying down. Let's run it from the top of the adagio." The pianist struck the opening chords, and the dancers moved. Crystal watched them, a profound sense of peace settling over her. This was her masterpiece, The Glass Floor. It was a contemporary ballet in 3 acts, directly inspired by the shattered champagne flutes, the suffocating weight of poverty, and the agonizing rebirth of her artistic soul. It incorporated classical point work, but violently subverted it with grounded, sharp, modern movements. It was raw, unapologetic, and highly anticipated by the global arts community. More importantly, it was funded by a mind at peace. 3 miles away, at Mount Sinai Hospital, Chloe was in remission. The bone marrow transplant, entirely covered by Crystal's signing bonus from the Phoenix Endowment, had been a resounding success. The crushing weight of medical debt that had forced Crystal to serve caviar to billionaires was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective gratitude. Meanwhile, downtown in the financial district, gratitude was in incredibly short supply. Sterling Hayes was bleeding out, corporately speaking. The viral video from the gala hadn't just been a 2-day PR nightmare. It had become a cultural touchstone for wealth inequality and corporate arrogance. The hashtag had evolved into a verb. When a wealthy executive was publicly shamed for bad behavior, the internet called it getting sterlinged. "We lost the Peterson account," Harrison, the chairman of the board for Hayes Capital, announced coldly. He sat at the opposite end of the mahogany boardroom table, his hands folded. "That's 300 million in assets under management, gone." They cited misaligned corporate values in their exit interview. Sterling rubbed his bloodshot eyes. He hadn't slept a full night in months. His impeccable Tom Ford suits hung slightly looser on his frame. "Peterson is an old fool. We'll replace the capital by the end of the quarter. I'm finalizing the aggressive buyout of—" "You're not finalizing anything, Sterling," Harrison interrupted, his voice like cracking ice. "The board held an emergency session this morning. Your erratic behavior, your obsessive vendetta against your uncle's foundation, and the continued public fallout have made you a liability. Hayes Capital is hemorrhaging institutional investors. They don't want their money managed by an internet meme. Sterling slammed his hands on the table, standing up. I built this fund's current valuation. My father left me a dinosaur, and I turned it into an apex predator. You can't oust me. Watch us, Harrison replied calmly. You have until Friday to secure a major PR victory that stabilizes the stock, or we invoke the morality clause in your contract and force a vote of no confidence. Fix this, Sterling, or pack your office. Sterling stormed out of the boardroom, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He retreated to his private office and locked the door. He didn't need a PR victory. He needed to crush the source of his humiliation. Crystal Woods' inaugural showcase was scheduled for Friday night. If she succeeded, she would cement her status as a cultural icon, and his Uncle Richard would look like a visionary. Sterling picked up his phone and dialed a private fixer he kept on retainer. I need a favor, an expensive one. Who holds the staging and lighting contract for the Phoenix Endowment Showcase at Lincoln Center? Give me 2 minutes, the voice on the other end rasped. Keyboard clacking echoed through the receiver. A boutique firm, Apex Theatrical Services. Buy them, Sterling ordered, his voice trembling with desperation. Use a shell company. Overpay by double if you have to. I don't care. Once you own them, cancel the contract for Friday night. Cite a sudden supply chain failure. Liquidate their inventory. I want Crystal Woods and my uncle standing on a pitch-black stage with no lights, no sets, and a theater full of refunded tickets. It will cost millions, Mr. Hayes, and the legal fallout for breach of contract. Do it, Sterling screamed, hurling a crystal paperweight across the room. It shattered against the wall, a pathetic echo of the night his life began to unravel. Leave them in the dark. Friday evening arrived, bringing with it a palpable, electric tension that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the David H. Koch Theater at Lincoln Center. The air backstage was thick, smelling sharply of aerosol hairspray, crushed pine rosin, and the distinct metallic tang of pure adrenaline. Dancers stretched in the dimly lit wings, their bodies contorting into impossible angles, whispering breathless words of encouragement to one another. The world outside these walls, the critics from London and Paris, the wealthy patrons in their silk evening wear, the internet commentators who had turned this night into a global spectacle, felt 1,000,000 miles away. In her private dressing room, Crystal Woods sat in absolute silence. She was meticulously wrapping her left ankle, the one held together by a network of titanium screws, in rigid, flesh-colored athletic tape. Every pull of the adhesive was a physical reminder of the floor she had crashed onto 3 years ago, and the marble floor she had conquered 6 months prior. She slipped a supple leather ballet slipper onto her right foot, leaving the taped left foot bare. A sharp, authoritative knock at the door broke her concentration. Richard Sterling stepped inside, closing the heavy door securely behind him. He looked unusually pale, leaning more heavily than usual on his silver-tipped walking stick, but his eyes burned with a fierce, quiet triumph. 5 minutes to places, Crystal, Richard said, his low baritone steady. But before you go out there, you need to know about a slight complication we had this morning. Crystal's hands froze on her laces. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What kind of complication? Is someone hurt? Is Chloe okay? Chloe is perfectly fine, currently sitting in the royal box, Richard reassured her, waving a hand. The complication involves my nephew. Sterling attempted a hostile, forced buyout of Apex Theatrical yesterday. Crystal frowned, the name of their staging vendor triggering a wave of dread. He tried to buy our lighting company. He tried to buy them so he could immediately liquidate their inventory and breach our contract, Richard explained, sitting in the velvet chair opposite her vanity. He wanted to plunge this theatre into darkness tonight. He wanted to strand you on a pitch-black stage with no music, no sets, and 3,000 refunded tickets. It was a desperation move, a cornered animal lashing out. Crystal felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Did he do it? Richard, are we going out there without lights? A slow, genuinely warm smile spread across Richard's face, easing the tired lines around his eyes. He had the money, Crystal. He offered double their valuation through a shell company. But what my nephew will never understand is that you cannot buy leverage over human decency. The owner of Apex, a stubborn man named Robert, called me this afternoon. He formally rejected the buyout. Crystal exhaled a shaky, uneven breath. Why? Because Robert has a 14-year-old daughter who studies ballet, Richard said, his voice thickening with emotion. She watched the video of you at the Belvedere estate 1,000 times. She has your picture taped to her bedroom mirror. She begged her father not to sell to Hayes Capital. Robert told Sterling's army of corporate lawyers to go straight to hell. The lights are on, Crystal. The stage is yours. Sterling fired his final bullet, and he completely missed. Tears pricked Crystal's eyes, hot and fast, but she blinked them away, refusing to ruin her stage makeup. She stood up, grabbing her sleek carbon fiber cane, her posture straightening into a line of unbreakable steel. Then let's go put on a show. Out in the massive, vaulted auditorium, the grand crystal chandeliers began to slowly dim. The chaotic, buzzing hum of the elite audience fell into a hushed, reverent silence. In the absolute last row of the upper mezzanine, cloaked deep in the shadows, sat Sterling Hayes. He was stripped of his usual bespoke tuxedo, wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low and a nondescript trench coat. He was hiding like a fugitive in the very city he used to own. He stared down at the stage, his hands gripping the velvet armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. He had checked his phone just 3 minutes ago. Harrison, the chairman of the board, had sent a single, devastating text message. The Apex acquisition failed. The board convenes tomorrow at 8 a.m. Bring your legal counsel. You are finished. The heavy, crimson velvet curtain rose. For the next 2 hours, the audience was entirely spellbound. The glass floor was a revelation of modern dance. Crystal's choreography was violently beautiful, a perfect kinetic translation of trauma, poverty, and eventual triumph. The company dancers threw themselves into the complex, physically agonizing movements with everything they had, leaving their souls on the marley floor. But the true, world-stopping climax arrived in the final 10 minutes of the third act. The stage plunged into absolute pitch blackness. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous theatre. Then a single, sharp, blindingly white spotlight pierced the dark, illuminating the dead center of the stage. Crystal Woods stood there. She wasn't holding her cane. She wore a simple, flowing, blood-red dress that starkly contrasted with the oppressive blackness surrounding her. She wore no point shoes. The music, a haunting, stripped-down, incredibly mournful cello solo, began to weep from the orchestra pit. Crystal didn't leap. She didn't execute the rapid, gravity-defying fouette turns that had defined her as a teenage prodigy. Instead, she delivered a masterclass in raw, unfiltered emotional storytelling. She utilized port-de-bras, the carriage of the arms, and intricate, agonizingly slow floor work. Every extension of her arm, every tortured arch of her spine, every slow, trembling rise from the floor spoke of profound pain, relentless resilience, and an unbreakable spirit. She used her physical limitation not as a tragic crutch to be hidden, but as the very emotional anchor of the entire performance. She was showing the world that true grace was not defined by physical perfection or flawless technique, but by the sheer, unadulterated courage to continue moving forward when the entire world demanded that you stop. In the back row, Sterling Hayes watched her, utterly paralyzed. The sneering, arrogant billionaire who demanded a waitress dance for $100 bills was gone, completely hollowed out by the undeniable, magnificent truth playing out under the spotlight. He had tried to buy her dignity. He had tried to buy her family's medical debt. He had tried to buy the very lights above her head. And yet, here she was, shining brighter than any star in the city, while he was trapped in the dark, watching his empire turn to ash. A single traitorous tear slipped down Sterling's cheek, cutting a path through the cold sweat on his face. He didn't bother to wipe it away. Slowly, heavily, he stood up. He turned his back on the stage, pushed through the heavy exit doors, and walked out of the theater, slipping quietly into the unforgiving New York night. He was finally a ghost. On stage, the cello struck its final, melancholic, lingering chord. Crystal sank softly to the floor, her head bowed in deep submission to the music, one arm reaching upward toward the fading beam of light. The spotlight cut out. Total blackout. The silence in the David H. Koch Theater lasted for 5 agonizing heartbeats. Then, the room exploded. It was a physical wall of sound. 3,000 people leaped to their feet simultaneously, screaming, weeping, and applauding with a ferocious intensity that shook the dust from the high rafters. The stage lights flared back on in a brilliant wash of gold, revealing the entire company of dancers standing in a perfect semicircle behind Crystal. Crystal stood up. She didn't look broken. She didn't look like a humiliated caterer or a tragic, fallen prodigy. She looked like exactly what she was: a master of her craft, a fierce survivor, and the newly crowned, undisputed queen of the New York arts scene. Richard Sterling walked out from the stage wings, tears freely streaming down his weathered cheeks, and handed Crystal a massive, overflowing bouquet of deep red roses. She accepted them, her smile radiant, exhausted, and entirely genuine. Crystal stepped forward to the very edge of the stage, looking out at the endless sea of faces, the flashing cameras, the thunderous, overwhelming love pouring over her. She placed her right foot carefully behind her taped left foot, bent her knees, and executed a deep, flawless, and deeply graceful bow. She had stolen the spotlight, and this time nobody was ever taking it away. The story of Crystal Woods and Sterling Hayes is a dramatic reminder that true power doesn't reside in bank accounts, intimidation, or the ability to humiliate others. Sterling believed his wealth made him invincible, mistaking cruelty for strength. Crystal, however, proved that real grace is forged in adversity. By transforming her deepest trauma into a breathtaking work of art, she not only reclaimed her identity, but utterly dismantled the arrogant worldview of the man who tried to break her. When we face bullies who demand we shuffle, the most devastating retaliation is simply choosing to soar on our own terms.